So welcome to the last lecture of this academic year at Society. And as you can see, we have an alternative arrangement for showing slides because the audiovisual system is packed it in. It knows that summer holidays is around the corner and has decided that it's going to leave a few days early. But thanks to Maddie and to Allison and others, we've got something very great that will allow Mariam and Anna to illustrate the lecture. It is a real pleasure to welcome both of them here to the Society in order to give their talk about the reinstallation of the wooden ceiling from Torrijos in southern Spain, which has just gone up in the new annex of the. Is it open to the public?
It is indeed, yes.
In some out of the way location in outer London.
We'll talk about it.
But I think it's accessible on the Victoria line.
No, it's on the Elizabeth line and the overground. It's extremely accessible.
So we'll all
It just takes a little bit of time to get there. Yeah.
Well, this weekend to have a look at it. And it's a particular pleasure to invite to welcome Anna back here because just exactly a year ago, the Society had an away day to Dublin, which she hosted at Trinity College Dublin and at the Chester PD. And it was a fantastic success where 20 of us, I think 20 of us from London, we went to see our Irish counterparts and Irish members and reestablish cordial relations, both in a series of talks and at Trinity College, and then viewings at the Chester PD, which were tremendously interesting, and then a lovely dinner afterwards. Kind of spirit. So I remember, if I can remember. So it's nice to be able to welcome back and to have Mariam here. Mariam Rosser-Owen is the curator of the Islamic world at the V&A. So it's our local expertise, and she's an expert of particularly of the Islamic Mediterranean, of the Maghreb and Al-Andalus, and her expertise dovetails very well with Anna's work in southern Spain. And I guess you've known each other for a very
a long time, yeah.
long.
Yeah.
So without further ado, I welcome you both here, and I truly look forward to you.
Thank you. So before we start, can I just check you can hear us okay with this level of microphone? Do I need to bring it closer? Volume okay? No.
Is it working, the microphone?
The microphone isn't plugged into the system, so it's just the.
So there is no in-room mic, so
No.
you need to speak up.
Right, okay, fine. Okay, well, as Norbert has already introduced, the V&A East Storehouse, which is what you can see on the slide, opened at the end of May. And this is our new V&A's new storage facility, but it's a visitable storage, so it's a museum. You can access all of this as a member of the public completely for free. And it's also going to be where you would go if you wanted to have a study appointment, which you would need to book in advance. So I can, if you go to the link on the slide, then you can find out all the details about how to do that. And it's in East London. It's in Stratford in the former Olympic Park site. And as you can hopefully see in the slide, what's installed in Storehouse includes 6 large-scale architectural fragments. One of those is the Agra colonnade, which is sort of, you can't see it, it's under the ground, because of the weight of that was just too high to put on anything other than ground level. And the Torrijos Ceilings. So that's what you can see over here, which is across 2 levels of this public walkway. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So now it's back on public view after decades of being in storage. So the Torrijos ceiling, just to start by giving you a sort of description and explanation of what it is. So this is a wooden carpentry ceiling. It's completely covered in gilding and pigments and paintwork. And because you can't really tell from this photograph the sort of gradient of the different pitches of the ceiling, we've got this little cross section down in the corner that was prepared for us by one of our project collaborators. So it's made in around the 1490s for a palace in a small town called Torrijos, which is very close to Toledo. We'll talk about that a bit later. And the palace was built by two people who were members of the high nobility and the court of the Catholic Monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. So the husband was Gutierre de Cárdenas, and you can see his coats of arms in the corners here and here. And the wife was Teresa Enríquez, and these are her coats of arms in the opposite corners. So the ceiling is covered in their sort of heraldic devices. So Gutierre was credited with introducing Ferdinand and Isabella to each other before they were married. And apparently the story goes that it. Oh, okay.
Down there.
Sorry about that. Okay, so the story goes that Gutierre and Isabella Gutierre introduced Ferdinand and Isabella to each other, and before they were married. And he did that in a gathering of a group of men. He pointed out Gutierre got lost now. He pointed out Ferdinand by saying esse, that one. And that is the same as the letter S in Spanish. So as a result of that, he was given the honor of having a kind of decorated letter S is in his heraldic devices. So that you can see that all over the ceiling and all over the decoration of the palace. But then predominantly the ceiling is this kind of Islamic style geometric design with these 8-pointed stars, which are the central motif of these skirt, what we call skirt panels, going all the way around. And then at the bottom, you can just about see in the image, there is a plaster frieze. And at the base of the plaster frieze is this legible Arabic inscription. And that's repeating one single phrase again and again, which we'll talk about later. And what you can see now is all plaster cast, because the original plaster was too fragmentary and fragile to remove from the building. So this is Torrijos. This is the location of Torrijos here. And it was the capital of these two nobles that I mentioned, Gutierre de Cárdenas and Teresa Enríquez. They had a sort of lordship in this whole region, but Torrijos was effectively their capital and the site of their extensive architectural patronage. But sadly, the only building that survives out of all of the buildings that they commissioned is the church, the Colegiata over here. So the palace isn't standing today. This is another palace that they built in another town called Ocaña, to give you a sense of what the palace might originally have looked like. So the Torrijos Palace was quite unusual because it had 4 magnificent ceilings. So often this type of Castilian palace of the 15th century will have one spectacular domed ceiling. But at Torrijos we have 4. And when the palace was dismantled and its furnishings sold off, as we'll talk about later, all of the ceilings have passed into different public collections around the world, public and private collections around the world. So this is where you can find them today. So I'm now going to hand over to Anna to talk a bit more about the relationship of Torrijos with and the ceilings with Islamic architecture.
Thank you very much, Mariam. That's the one I can reach it. So in this research project that Mariam and I have been running over the past 3-4 years, 5 years even now, looking at the Torrijos ceiling in the V&A, we have been trying to understand really the context within which this ceiling was produced and the way that this ceiling was made and different aspects of it. And one of those aspects is really the present day scholarship within Spain, which is some of which a lot of which we engaged with over the past number of years in our project. But really, there is generally a lack of scholarship and knowledge about this kind of material across both in Spanish and in English language. The main figure who has been studying these is a carpenter scholar called Enrique Nuere, who has really been the only person who's really spoken with any, been published very much about this. And this has really been a point of contention for us, is really trying to understand how he has framed these and to really reframe that idea ourselves about what we understand about these ceilings. Because for Nuere, who is an architectural historian and a carpenter himself, he sees these ceilings as belonging to what he sees as a European, Northern European, non-Muslim context. So he wants to frame these very much within, and that's what he's published on, within a European tradition. So this is a very recent publication from 2025. It's from an article in a newspaper, but in the translation it says, Nuere, the greatest Spanish expert in historical wooden ceilings, recognizes the incorporation of Islamic elements, but distances its construction from Muslim hands. The Muslims brought us plaster, ceramics, or complex geometry, and we Castilians have brought the European knowledge of carpentry. In the Islamic world, they didn't have wooden ceilings because they didn't need them. Yes. Now, this is very much the accepted view of how these ceilings were made and why they were made. And actually, really, it's a lot of Spanish scholars would not agree with that today. But it is certainly in the realm of carpentry and these carpentry ceilings. This is how they are perceived. In our study of these ceilings, we've really looked very much to the broader history of the ceilings construction and found some evidence really for their origins being the origins of their techniques and their use and their construction in North Africa. So this is a transfer section of the Kutubiyya Mosque in Marrakesh, which has 4 ceilings made using similar techniques, and certainly with the same geometry and combination of plasterwork and woodwork that we find later in the Torrijos ceiling. So these are dated to the 12th century. And while the dating of ceilings is very difficult actually to establish, it's very hard to know when a ceiling, whether it's been replaced or repaired. These seem to us to be some of the oldest ceilings of this type that we have. But of course, they are also very much related to wider carpentry techniques across the Islamic world. And we have evidence for that in many surviving objects, including the portable wooden mihrab, the photograph of which you see on the left here, from the mid-12th century, which is now in the Museum of Islamic Art in Cairo. And on the right here, you see panels from a minbar made for Sultan Najin, so the Ibn Tulun Mosque from the 13th century. So you can see similar techniques, the very same techniques, in fact, here used on furniture. And I think what we have been able to certainly suggest in our research is that these ceilings are connected to the wider practice of carpentry within the Islamic world and within furniture as well. So they're part of that longer tradition. I have worked a lot on the Alhambra, as has Mariam, and we looked a lot at the buildings of the Alhambra, the Nasrid palaces of the Alhambra in Granada, as a place of incubation for some of these carpentry ideas to be displayed and also seen in these ceilings. So in the Alhambra, it preserves many of the older ceilings, the oldest ceilings, using this technique. Now, there are contemporary ceilings with the Alhambra across the rest of the Iberian Peninsula, including in Toledo, for example. But I think we can see within the Alhambra this very important palace, the residential palace of the Nasrid kings, the Nasrid sultans, and a palace that would become the residential palace of the Catholic monarchs in the 15th century. We can see a place where many of these ceilings were widely seen and understood to be important within palatial contexts. In Granada itself, then, just to show you some of examples of other ceilings which show the continuity of this tradition, we see here, this is from the Cuarto Real de Santo Domingo in Granada, and it's one of the earliest Islamic palaces in Granada. It's from the late 13th century, and it has one of these wooden ceilings. These are not just anywhere in a building, though. They're not, just covering any space. They cover the most important space of these palaces. So they cover the throne rooms or the reception rooms or the kubbas, the cube-shaped rooms where the important salons, in some ways, where things would happen and meetings would occur. We have, of course, from Granada, from the Alhambra itself, we have, so the Cuarto Real that I've just showed you is just outside of the Alhambra, it's in Granada, but up in Granada, in the palaces of the Alhambra, up in the Alhambra, we have a lot of furniture as well, which is, which attests to the kind of enormous quantity of woodwork that must have been being produced by the Nasserids at this time. The Nasserids in Granada were building lots and lots of buildings at the same time, not just in the Alhambra, but also in the wider city of Granada. And the furniture and ceilings all must have come from, a lot of them would have come from the same workshops. Here you can see one of the earliest wooden ceilings, two of the earliest wooden ceilings that survive from the Alhambra, and these are early 14th century, the first decades of the 14th century. On the left, you see the portico, so it's the portico of the Partal, a pavilion, which is one of the pavilions of the Alhambra. And then on the right, you see the ceiling above the Mirador, which is in the same palace. So this palace is an early 14th century palace in the Alhambra. And they just show you the variety, really. This image shows you the variety of styles that are used in the woodwork here, that you can cover different spaces, but they are used to cover the important spaces in these buildings. This ceiling on the right is now in the Museum of Islamic Art in Berlin. It's been there, it's been in Berlin since the 19th century, in fact, and it's due to when the Museum of Islamic Art reopens, you'll be able to see it there again in its new display. One of the most recognizable and important surviving palaces in the Alhambra is the Comares Palace. And that's because it was retained by the Catholic monarchs in 1492 as their throne hall. So it was the throne hall of the Nasrid rulers. It was built in the 14th century. And it became then later the throne hall and the main reception room of the Catholic monarchs. So it's been retained as this very important space. And it is crowned with a ceiling of the same technique that you can see on the right. In this case, it's enormous, though. It's 11 meters by 11 meters. And it's this really monumental ceiling that crowns that space and really gives it that sense of being an important place. And I think that's what you can, we found it really interesting to look at these ceilings, both from below and also from behind, because it gives you an idea of their structure and how hard they were to build, how difficult it was to construct them, but also how these are really objects they're almost like suspended sculptures that sit above these rooms. They're not structurally functional in that they are not keeping the rain out. They are instead covering these rooms, and they're part of the internal decoration of these important spaces. So here on the left, you can see in this plan and section of the plan here in the section of the Torre de Comares, of this throne hall, you can see this is the ceiling here, the 11-meter ceiling, but above it we have a roof, which does the proper function of a roof. And here you can see it. We had the privilege, Mariam and I, of going up to this space here. We were standing really on scaffolding in this space above the throne hall to look at how this ceiling was constructed, and to really see they look very different, but they're just as interesting almost from behind as from below. So these ceilings, in other words, are made to define spaces and to give spaces within palaces, especially, a high status. And that's what you also see with smaller ceilings, but when the technique really developed in the Alhambra, I think it's in the Alhambra that many of these new techniques of carpentry were tested out and were displayed. You can see that in these pavilions either side of the Lion's Court, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, of the Alhambra, again 14th century, slightly later in the 14th century. And these are very small pavilions which have pools of water beneath them. But above them, when you look up within those, they have these hemispherical ceilings, which are much smaller than the 11 meters by 11 meters, but in some ways much more difficult to construct because these are perfectly hemispherical ceilings made using very difficult carpentry techniques. They're actually known as media naranja, half orange, partly because they are the shape of half an orange, but also because some of them were sort of segmented to look like the different segments of an orange. And there are two of them. But you'll note also that they are accompanied by plasterwork, and that's a really important part of these ceilings that really we've noticed in our study of them very much, that the woodwork always goes alongside plasterwork. So beneath you see the muqarnas here, and you see the sebka motifs, and this plasterwork both complements and works alongside that woodwork. The wood, of course, is painted and would have been, you can see in the Torrijos ceiling that the paint still survives. So this media naranja, the hemispherical ceiling, became the most difficult kind of ceiling that the carpenters could make. It became at the absolute peak of carpentry techniques, and the carpenters had to be specially trained in order to be able to make them. They were very expensive also, so these were only made for the most luxurious of palaces. Here we see 3 of the 5 surviving examples. I've shown you the other 2 in the Lion's Court, and these are much later, but there must have been other examples that we've lost in between. But interestingly, we have one from Torrijos. So this central ceiling here is in the museum, the Archaeological Museum in Madrid. And this is one of the 4 Torrijos ceilings. In other words, it's a sister ceiling to the one in the V&A. And this uses this media naranja. You can see the half orange segments a bit better here, perhaps, in this extraordinary ceiling with its muqarnas here and the plasterwork beneath it, which very much work alongside it. So these, as I said, are used to define spaces, and the spaces we know are important because some of them survive in those spaces. This ceiling here is still today in the Alcázar in Seville, and it's over the Hall of the Ambassadors in Seville, and it's dated to 1427. It's from the mid-15th century, really. And here on the right, we have the other media naranja, half orange hemispherical wooden ceiling which is also in Seville, but it's in the Casa de Pilatos. So in a private palace in Seville from the 16th century. So in between these two, then we have the Torrijos ceilings, which all 4 of which are different, and demonstrate different techniques, including the most important of ceilings of techniques, which is this half orange. So if we put those ceilings back into the palace, can they tell us something about how they were used and the spaces that they were used for? These 4 ceilings are very different, but we know from a description from a description from the 16th century that the very expensive gilded dome, as it was described, went over the chapel. And we know that this space, which is in the plan, I don't know why the laser isn't working on the screen. Ah, there it is, yeah. I don't know if you can see, so you can see it on Zoom, but not on the screen, but on the, Mariam will point it out there. The chapel is on the lower right corner. And we know that is, the most important space within this palace. Here in this image, you can see the 4 ceilings, which are on the upper story. They're not on the ground floor, they're on the upper story. Here in the central image, you can see a photograph from the late 19th century of the palace, which is being dismantled, which Mariam will talk about. And then the other 3 ceilings. And which one is the V&A? Well, it's top right. We think this is where it went in our kind of reconstruction of this palace. We think that the V&A ceiling was the ceiling which crowned the space used for possibly reception and banqueting. The other hint towards that comes from the Arabic writing, which Mariam mentioned goes below this ceiling. And I'm just trying to move this on, but it doesn't seem to be responding on the PowerPoint.
All right.
Wait till it loads, that's it.
There we go. Okay.
Perfect. So the plasterwork beneath, there's always plasterwork beneath these ceilings, and often it has inscription. In the Alhambra is covered with inscriptions, with writing, poetic, often specific to the particular place. And the writing here has been identified as it's a repeated phrase meaning "and you," plural, drink from happiness. وَتَشْرَبُونَ مِنَ السُّرُورِ. So it indicates perhaps what people might do beneath that ceiling in Torrijos itself from when it was built in the 1490s. I'm going to hand over now to Mariam to speak about the dispersals.
Okay, so I mentioned that Torrijos had been an important town in the end of the 15th century, but quite soon after that, it became much less important. So people would go to Toledo, but they wouldn't necessarily go to Torrijos. So it seemed to sort of not be on any of the main pilgrimage or travel routes around Spain. And as a result, it basically became a backwater, and sadly, its buildings started to fall into a bad state of repair. So by the end of the 19th century, when we have this article by Enrique Repulliers, which has this very important plan of the building and also a description of how the palace looked at that period, he ended his article. I mean, he could see that it was in such a bad state of repair that it was, potentially going to fall down very soon. And he sort of ended his article with this cry, for somebody to come along and preserve it. But sadly, that didn't happen. So the palace sort of stood. What you're looking at here is the main square in the town of Torrijos, which is now called the Plaza de España. And the palace would have occupied the entire width of this main square, with its monumental portal located here where the road cuts through now. So by the end of the 19th century, the palace was owned by two local businessmen. They divided it into two parts, and then they started to sell off the furnishings. And this article was published in 1902, celebrating the, architectural wonders of this palace. But actually, it was basically a sales catalogue, because it was inviting people to come to Torrijos and buy these, lovely examples of ceilings, but also plaster, lintels that you can see in the image here, and other examples that we'll show in a bit. So shortly after the publication of this article, we can date this photograph, which is one of very few photos we've been able to find showing the interior of the palace. And this is circa 1903. You can see how some of the ceilings have already started to be dismantled, and that's probably what's stacked up in the corners of this courtyard. And I think it's quite poignant that it shows this cart as kind of standing ready to take all of this stuff away. So in addition to the ceilings, some other elements of the palace have been located, and they include the monumental portal. So this was a huge stone portal that was stood at the entrance to the palace, which was bought by someone who was a lady in waiting of Isabel II, the late Isabella, in the 19th century, and relocated her hunting estate, which is where it stands today, the Finca Alamin, and is at the entrance to her chapel. So this is her chapel, and then a local Spanish Toledo, associated antiquities dealer and collector bought. This is an internal lintel from above a door in the palace. But he also acquired other bits of plasterwork and tile panels and the ceiling that Anna talked about that's now in Madrid. And he built a little tower building to house that ceiling, and then it was decorated with all of these other elements of the palace that he acquired. And those still stand in this little town called Oropesa, which is even smaller than Torrijos. Although the ceiling was then sold to the Archaeological Madrid Museum by his nieces. So in terms of the V&A's acquisition of our ceiling, we bought it from this man called Lionel Harris, who seems to have been involved in selling maybe all of the ceilings from the Torrijos Palace, but that's still speculation. He ran something called the Spanish Art Gallery that was based in London and Madrid. And the V&A made many acquisitions of Spanish art from him in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So this letter is the earliest paperwork on file about the acquisition of this ceiling from May 1904. And Harris has just come back from visiting Spain,
and he's been in treaty for the Arab roof. I've highlighted these bits on the letter that you can see, and he undertakes to deliver the ceiling to the V&A in perfect condition. So that suggests that he's going to do a level of restoration on the ceiling before he hands it over to the V&A. And here is where he talks about the plaster on the wall. So he says that the plaster cannot be had, as in taking it off, it falls to bits. But some pieces, however, which could be saved, sufficient for you to copy from, will be included. So and we do actually have some examples of the original plaster frieze in the V&A, which are now two examples of which are displayed alongside the Torrijos ceiling at Storehouse. So we also have a couple of photographs in the V&A files, which seem to be, again, some of the very few surviving examples of photographs of these ceilings in situ in the palace. And this gives you a sense of the condition that it was in at the time that the building was being sort of dismantled. So you can see these little missing elements here. This panel here is just kind of slipping out of position. So when we began to work on the Torrijos ceiling for the Storehouse project, which was actually 5 years ago this month in June 2020, it was all happening in COVID. It was taken, so it had been in storage in these crates for, since the 90s, and was moved into a conservation studio in Faversham, where they had these two spaces. They could spread the whole ceiling, all of the different sections of the ceiling out across these two spaces, which made it, when we could go and visit it and really start to look up close at the ceiling for the first time in living memory, and start to identify some things. So I've lost the cursor again, but I'm just talking about on the backs. At a certain point in the conservation treatment, they turned these panels over, and we could look at the back, and we started to see these kinds of tool marks, which we were wondering what they meant. And most of the colleagues in Spain who we've been collaborating with don't tend to study these things from the back, because most of them are still in situ. You can't necessarily easily get to the back, or you can't see these kinds of tool marks. So this was a kind of open question during the conservation project. So the sort of key finding of the conservation study was that the ceiling in the V&A had been altered very soon after it had been originally created. So the photos I showed you before have the different sections of the ceiling have these friezes that go horizontally and vertically around the ceiling and separate the decoration into sort of different compartments. And we discovered that those had been added at a slightly later date in order to cover over breaks in the ceiling. So originally the ceiling would have looked like this, and again our colleague Javier made this visualization of the ceiling's original appearance. Without any breaks or interruptions in the design, it would have flowed from one pitch to another across the ceiling. But it seems to have been installed somewhere and then very soon afterwards taken down, and we don't know whether that was within the Torrijos Palace in a different space, and then it was moved to a different room, or if it was made, for another building and moved to Torrijos, although these ceilings tend to be made for specific spaces because they have to be made for particular dimensions. Anyway, taking it down then damaged these kinds of intersections that go from sort of one part to the next, and they had to then be covered over by these gilded frieze panels. And we know that those are from the same date roughly as the ceiling, because one of these they've got kind of a scale design on them, and on the back of one of those was also a kind of Muqarnas version of Muqarnas, so the same type of design was being made in the same workshop. And just the visual language and the gilding and everything is all very sort of consistent with the rest of the ceiling. So it must have happened quite a short time after it was originally installed. And we also discovered a few areas that were quite interesting to see, because these are reused bits of wood. So you can see, and this is where it's located on the different sections of the ceiling. So there's a piece of wood here where the applied ornament has slightly shifted out of position and is revealing a sort of older paint scheme underneath. And then this one down here is only visible kind of from the back of the panel, but again, there's an older paint scheme that's visible there, so it's kind of suggesting that wood was hanging around. You know, maybe it had already been used for another project, rejected for whatever reason, but then it was still in the workshop, so it was used for the Torrijos Ceiling. And we also found these little indications of more recent work to the ceiling. So these are from the back of the plaster casts, of the plaster frieze. And they're nice little signatures from our technicians of the early 20th century giving us their names and telling us when they did this work. And this one here is quite useful because it gives the date of 1910, which is quite an interesting thing. I'll come back to in a second. And then on the support structure for the ceiling, so this is its wooden timber structure that had been created for the V&A at the beginning of the 20th century when it was first installed. And this has been largely reused in the storehouse installation, but they found this signature which gives the names of these 4 technicians who had worked on the installation of it in 1909. So it was on display. We can talk. We didn't go into that in this talk, but we can talk a bit more about that in the questions later if you like. At the end of the Raphael, what's now the Raphael Cartoon Gallery, there's an apt space there. The Torrijos ceiling had been installed at the top of that space. But when that gallery was refurbished in the 90s, that's when it came down and went into storage in 1993. So the storehouse project has brought it back out of storage and on public display for the first time in 30 years. So back to Anna now. I'm just going to talk to you about our research project in a bit more detail.
So the planned new display of the ceiling allowed us the unprecedented opportunity to be able to view this ceiling in when it's dismantled and after its restoration, before and after its restoration, which is, as Mariam said, is very unusual to be able to see ceilings in this state really up close. So we took the opportunity to set up a research project around this called Crafting Medieval Spain, which has had a number of activities that I'll explain to you and outputs as well. And one of the main and most important of these activities was connecting with our colleagues in Torrijos and in Spain, who have a great knowledge and understanding of their own history within Torrijos itself, as well as of the history of some of these ceilings. So we visited Torrijos in November 2021. So we had an online workshop first, a virtual viewing in COVID of the ceiling during its restoration. And then we traveled to Torrijos, to Madrid for first of all for a conference, and then to Torrijos for to look at both at the town of Torrijos, but also to look at contemporary buildings that were built by the same couple, Gutierre and Teresa, who patronized many other different buildings within the town of Torrijos. I think both Mariam and I were hugely impressed by what is left in Torrijos still, including the Collegiata. Although much has been destroyed, it's still an incredibly important historic city with an excellent knowledge and awareness of its own history and the restoration of that. So that was a very satisfying thing to do. We learned a lot, certainly, from that. You can see us there in the middle, in the central photo, looking at some of the wood work on display. And here on the left, we filmed also we made some interviews with experts and people who have knowledge of the history of the region. And we made it into a film, which is available on the V&A website. I'm not going to play it now just for time reasons, but have we got time?
I think so.
I'll play an extract from it then. So we interviewed different people, including one of the from the council. They have an sector in the council, just on their thoughts about the ceiling, their knowledge of it, and what it means to them, especially to have the ceiling in the V&A today, because we're very well aware that this ceiling is not in Torrijos anymore. It was sold and it's now in the V&A. So what does that mean within the context of Torrijos today to those who understand it? And this extract is by
Es la primera vez que
Fernando Torres, who is from the Cultural Department of the government of the local council of Torrijos.
So it's frozen.
And it's just a short extract from that. So I think
If we're going to have difficulties with it, then maybe let's give it up. But it seems to have just stopped. And
el alamín y me ha sorprendido muchísimo enfrentarme a la fachada y ver el tamaño de la misma. Cuando ves las cosas en la distancia te imaginas un tamaño diferente y cuando estás a los pies de la fachada te sorprende la escala que tiene la misma. En cierta medida creo que es una analogía con los personajes. El paso del tiempo los hace pequeñitos y cuanto más te acercas a ellos, más vuelves a valorar realmente la dimensión que tuvieron. Este proyecto en el que estamos ahora con todos vosotros ha supuesto una conexión de alegría y de dolor. ¿Por qué? Porque somos conscientes de que la pérdida patrimonial también supuso a lo largo de los siglos una pérdida de identidad. El patrimonio, aparte de la importancia histórico-artística, también te permite tener un vínculo con la historia. En la medida que el patrimonio ha ido desapareciendo, los torrijeños fueron perdiendo ese vínculo con los personajes y sobre todo con su proyecto. Los Cárdenas Enríquez lo que hicieron sobre todo en Torrijos era algo que estaba muy conectado con el Renacimiento, que era un proyecto intelectual. Haber estado con vosotros estos días tocando edificios que eran de la misma familia o partes del edificio que estaban o que están en otros espacios es, como digo, una gran alegría y a la verdad una gran frustración, aunque creo que ese sentimiento se tiene que reconducir. No hay que frustrarse, sino sentir orgullo de que las diferentes piezas están visitables en diferentes espacios, y lo que sí como institución nos parece muy importante es que eso en cierta medida sea un museo global, es decir, que podamos visitar todas las piezas que existen, toda la exposición casi itinerante, podríamos decir, y siempre volver a hacer valor de que realmente la exposición más importante de los Cárdenas Enríquez sigue estando en Torrijos.
So that was Fernando de Miguel Cuesta from the council. Among the interviews, which are on the Voices from Torrijos post that we have on our research website, which in the next slide, I will show you some of our activities. So this is just a boring list of kinds of things we've been doing in this research project. So we've given lots of lectures about it at different points and different stages and to different audiences, which has been really important actually and really useful. We have one thing that we found surprisingly helpful has been the Instagram account that we set up, which allowed us to connect with people everywhere from lots of different backgrounds and lots of different languages, and especially with our Spanish colleagues, but also further afield. So the Instagram account has been really helpful, as well as the research website, which is hosted by the V&A. So you can see a link to it here on the right-hand side. We have made several research visits to Torrijos, but also Toledo, to Granada, as well as to Berlin, to look at the ceiling that's there that I mentioned, that's from the Alhambra there, to look at its installation, in its new installation. And we've one of our outputs has been some academic publications. So we have an article in the Burlington, and then we have a new essay cluster. And you can see here the Burlington article from 2023. And then we published an essay cluster with people who had, our colleagues who we brought together for the conference in Madrid. And this looked at all aspects of the making, the dispersal and the display of this ceiling and of its sisters in the different centres around the world where this ceiling now is, this global museum that Fernando de Miguel Cuesta was talking about. But one of the most fun activities Mariam and I did, you can see we're enjoying ourselves in that photo down there, it was the British Academy Summer Showcase in June 2022, because it really allowed us to explore different methods of different ways of connecting people to a ceiling. You know, it's quite hard I mean, it's hard to display a ceiling, but also to engage with it as a member of the public beneath it in the museum. So we were testing out different strategies for how that might work best. And one of the more successful elements, so this was in a summer showcase where we had a stall essentially, and we had members of the public coming up to us, asking us questions about the ceiling. And we had different things they could do, activities. For example, looking at a SketchUp on an iPad, so looking at different models of the ceiling. But actually the hands-on puzzle was one of the most successful. You can see here, people could stand around it. And the puzzle is based, when you go and visit the ceiling and you look up, you will see an 8-pointed star motif, rueda it's called, and it is based on one of the elements here that you can see. I pointed out where it is there. And it's to scale. So it's a to-scale puzzle from painted with similar colors. So I think that was very successful, one of the more successful ways of engaging people with it. I'll pass back to Mariam now to talk about this new installation.
Well, so we started, having done all of the research in conservation, installation began in September 2023. That's the first bit going up, you can see there. And I mentioned before that we reused the support structure from early 20th century, but this was reinforced with new timbers. And one of the things we haven't mentioned is that this technique, this carpentry technique is known in Spanish. It's called carpintería de lo blanco, which translates as white carpentry. And that's because it's usually pine wood that is used to make these ceilings. And I think it's quite interesting to point out that new pine, which is what's been used for the support structure, looks very pale. So that I think helps you understand why this carpentry technique is called that. So this is Alan down here, who was a lead technician who led on the installation of the ceiling, which was a very complicated process. It altogether took a year. They weren't working constantly. There was conservation still going on, and then they had to do different bits at different times. They created this very clever hoist, which brought the different sections up into position, but then it had a hinge, so it could be angled in order to allow the different sections to be kind of held at the appropriate angle before they could be kind of tied in place. And I don't know if you can see up here, the green ties kind of holding it to the support structure, because until they got the last piece into position, they didn't want to nail anything down, because they did end up having to do quite a lot of movement to the ceiling to make sure that it all fitted together. While I'm on the slide, I just want to point out all the tiny little black pins on the back of this wooden section here. They're all nails. I was recently asked, how do all of these decorative elements stay in place, or they're all nailed on from front and back. We can talk about that a bit later if you like. So this is one of the squinches going up, and I think it's quite interesting to look at this slide, just what I was saying before about there being a gap between the different sections of the ceiling that was then covered over by these frieze panels. So these are the vertical scale design frieze panels, and then these are the Cardenas frieze panels that went on to hide this gap. And this is obviously very obvious in this image before they had installed them. So the technicians, harking back to the signatures of the 1909 installation, all the technicians signed their own names on the support structure. I didn't get to do that. We should have done that when we were there. And this is us standing underneath the centre parts of the ceiling. So they put that on right at the end. And there was obviously scaffolding built up into that level, but that will never be there again. That was the only time we'll build scaffolding again is when the ceiling comes out again, which hopefully will not be for a very long time. And here it is with beautiful new lighting, all cleaned by our conservation team. And Anna wanted me to show this slide just so you can do a kind of before and after. It's not really a fair comparison though, because this is old photography done in I don't know when, in the 90s, probably before the ceiling came down. And I think the space it was in before did not have good lighting. But yeah, so now it's got this beautiful lighting. But having installed the ceiling, that's sort of led us to understand some of these elements that we've noticed before. and couldn't really explain. And so I just circled 2 tool marks on the backs of some of the skirt panels. So what you've got here is the right edge of one panel and the left edge of another panel, but they've got matching tool marks. So it's these panels were prefabricated on the ground, and these marks are clearly indicating to the craftsmen who are working on the installation that you put this one next to this one. So that's on the horizontal kind of register, but it also works on the vertical register. So this here, we've got 2 other tool marks. This is one of the lower skirt panels, and this is one of the upper panels. So again, it's kind of indicating this one goes underneath this one. So that was quite interesting to realise that once the ceiling was actually installed and we could look at it from the back. And that is one of the nice things about the installation at Storehouse, is that you will be able to see the back of the Torrijos ceiling in all its kind of complexity, and it really tells the story of its life over 500 years. The only other ceiling that you can see from the back is the one in Madrid. So this is what you've got on the slide on the right, but that is in a little room. So there's a kind of gallery along here, a little walkway along the sort of this part here, which will only accommodate 3 people at a time or something. It's literally kind of hanging over the gallery below. So they have it there for maintenance. I mean, I'm not sure how effective it is, but nobody really gets to see this unless you go there on a special visit, as we were able to do. The V&A ceiling is accessible, so there's a kind of little walkway that goes around it so that we can get to it if we need to, but that's not open to the public, but you will be able to see it very clearly. These are the labels, so just to point out that you can find out more information by scanning the QR code there, and that will take you to some online resources. And then alongside the ceiling is these are called the hacked end displays. These sort of displays for objects that hopefully delve a little bit deeper into some of the aspects of the craftsmanship that goes into making ceilings like Torrijos, or palaces like the one it came from. So we had another Cárdenas boss in the collection, so we've been able to put that out. And the aesthetic of Storehouse is that it's a working museum, so you don't have museum displays in the way that you would have them at the V&A in South Kensington. They have this kind of sense of it being a work in progress, but still you get to see these objects up close. And so now we have people enjoying the ceiling. This is on the members' open day. Somebody got right down on the floor and started taking photos of the ceiling. But it's lovely to see. They've got these lovely reclining chairs, and Anna was enjoying one of those earlier today. And the Storehouse are going to be open late on Saturdays, and they're going to do Saturday lates in the same way that the South Kensington V&A does Friday late. So this is the first one showing a performance happening under the ceiling. And we just want to end by showing you another little film, which is a time-lapse film showing the journey of the ceiling all the way literally from storage to Storehouse.
Thank you.
All the cables.
That was great.
Thank you.
What fun. I'm stunned both by the construction and reconstruction, but also what it was originally and what it is now. So just, congratulations to you. I can't wait to go see it.
Yeah.
Let me ask a question first, and then we'll open the floor to questions. I was very struck by the fact that this very Islamic ceiling, which you showed precursors from North Africa, from the Maghreb region, was being adopted by the Teresa Enríquez family. And I was curious as to what their relationship was to the court, both or the other courts around it, and what were the sorts of why were they interested in this, and what were they trying to display by having this in their palace. So I'm just curious as to what that relationship was. I was also curious, given that you did this very interesting series of interviews with local residents, and did they ever reflect upon the Islamic dimensions of something that they were clearly both proud and felt pointed about, and did that inform their understanding of the contemporary social situation with some personally? So
Shall I ask the first question and then you can do the second one? So yeah, I probably didn't hear because it was at the beginning when we didn't have any microphone, but Gutierre and Teresa were at the heart of the court of the Catholic Monarchs. So Teresa was a lady in waiting of Isabel Católica, and Gutierre had this he held very senior positions in their court and was also the man responsible for introducing them. And this sort of connection to the Catholic Monarchs is expressed through including the Catholic Monarchs' coats of arms on their monumental portal. And in other parts of the palace, so there's another surviving plaster inscription in Latin, which is in Madrid, and that gives Ferdinandus Isabel. And they were probably also using the same architects and masons. So the portal that's now in the Finca-Alamin, the stone portal, has very close carving styles and aesthetic to examples of work that were being made for the Catholic Monarchs at the same time, including San Juan de los Reyes, which is a very important foundation by Isabel in Toledo. I mean, in terms of the connection with Alhambra, ironically, Gutierre was the man who took keys from the last Nasrid Sultan at the time of the conquest of Granada. So he was extremely wealthy because of his involvement in the wars of Granada. We think that connection to the Alhambra and its monumental ceilings inspired him to create so many in his own palace, and I can talk a bit more about that in a minute maybe. But yes, he's definitely expressing his power and his wealth through the construction of this palace and by giving it so many lavish ceilings.
Yeah, I think, he would have been continuing a tradition which was already extant very much within. You could see it in the Alhambra, but also in palaces in Castile. You know, there would have been other examples of these kinds of ceilings around, and the extent to which it would have been thought of as an Islamic ceiling or Islamic technique, even, or belonging to a different culture. I think he would have seen, I think the Alhambra at that time had become the palace, would become the palace of Ferdinand and Isabella, and became very much part of that aesthetic, the Castilian and the new Spanish kind of aesthetic at the time, and was understood as a perfectly suitable and very fashionable and highly desirable, expensive symbol of status at the time. So you're copying, you know, what you see around you as being high status, and that is the Alhambra, and that is also the palace of Ferdinand and Isabella. You know, so you're doing that in your palace then in Torrijos. I think, you know, when we visited Torrijos and spoke to, you know, historians, local historians, and people who were experts in the culture there, as well as residents and people familiar, I think they see that this as their heritage. They see this as very much belonging to Torrijos and to the area of Toledo. With a full awareness that that has a very diverse background to it, and that it includes techniques and motifs and designs and ideas that come from different cultures. I did talk about, you know, this other strand of Spanish scholarship in which it's claimed that this for European heritage, this kind of technique is claimed for European heritage. But we didn't find that amongst, when we spoke to people within Torrijos itself, they were very much aware of the mixed history of this, while perhaps not seeing this ceiling within the line of inheritance of the Alhambra directly, which I think we can see much more of a connection there because of our study of the techniques and of the inscriptions and those elements.
When just pass you
We'll take that one back.
Oh, sorry.
You have it.
Thank you. The measurements of all these timbers, which are rough in a sense when you look at that, where did you do the meticulous measurements? Was it in storage, or was it? Or had they been done before in '98?
I kept a slide in so that I could, because I knew somebody was going to ask about it.
Because the shapes, nothing else.
So my fabulous colleague Matthew, who was the sort of engineering lead on the installation, put this together. So when it was taken down in the 90s, there was very detailed documentation done at the time. So we had all the photography and yes, measurements from then. We also have in the archives this measured elevation from the palace itself, which he was referring to also. What you can see, so he created this sort of render for how to reconstruct it. There was no time, nor would there have been anywhere to do a test installation. So when they installed it, this is why it happened over quite a long, slow period, and they were sort of adapting as they went. So the darker timbers that you can see are the original support structure, and then the lighter ones are sort of reinforcing that they decided was necessary. Yeah, exactly, the white pine. And he did, because somebody did ask me this when I checked with him, so he calculated the total weight of the ceiling and the support structure as 7.5 tons. So just out of interest.
And I touched on this in your answer to Norbert, but I just wonder whether there's more to unpack in sort of the contemporary cultural politics, if that's the right word, behind the local expert carpenter Noere denying the Islamic hand. I mean, is there more of a story there about the way in which medieval Spanish art history generally is told? Because there must be more than ceilings that come from the Islamic tradition into medieval ornament.
Yeah, I mean,
it's a problem with engaging with the Islamic past.
It's there is a long-standing debate within Spanish scholarship, which has largely been solved by now, I think, but it was very strong in the 20th century and the late 19th century, a debate about the origins of Spanishness and Spanish identity. And it's a very well written up debate between Americo Castro and Sanchez Albornoz, two Spanish scholars who one of whom argued that Spanishness is essentially Christian European, and the other of whom argued for a more hybrid understanding in this idea of convivencia, or hybridity and a hybrid mix of Muslim and the relevance of the Muslim population and Jewish population to understanding Spanish identity today. It's complicated then in the 20th century under Franco and the different strands that come in there of thinking about Spanish past, and a kind of more wider across the sphere denial really of the importance of the Islamic history. But I think in the last 30 years, Spanish scholarship has done a huge amount to uncover the relevance and importance of its Islamic heritage as well as its Jewish heritage, and the roles that they play in Spanish identity today. And there's a great pride in that, I think, today within a majority in Spain. I don't know majority, I mean, who knows the way the tides are turning in politics, but certainly there is a real understanding of that today. So there's a really interesting history actually within Spanish historiography about that acceptance or denial of the relevance of Muslim heritage.
Do we know anything at all about the carpenters and the artisans? They come from Islamic and Catholic and Jewish backgrounds. Any idea, like, in India, you have around Islamic workers?
You've done the work on that.
Do we know who they are? We don't know. Interestingly, we know very little. We know very little about who actually built the palaces of the Alhambra. We know really very little about individual identities. We don't know very much about workshops. That's one of the fascinating aspects of it, is trying to uncover how those workshops function, because I think it's one thing that's really interesting is the combination of wood and plaster, how they always seem to go together, and how those were also complemented often by textiles, which within the palaces would have also been part of that aesthetic that we've lost today largely. So actually trades, guilds, expertise, craft expertise working together, working alongside each other, and to patterns and to orders, to royal commissions, is something which is an ongoing project really to try to uncover that. We don't have names. We don't have, at this point, at the early point, we don't have identities. We do start to get that in the 15th century though. By the time we get to the 15th century, we have the records, obviously from Castile, which have survived, and we have records from the 16th century as well, when we start to understand very much who these people were. And there's a really interesting manuscript which Mariam and I looked at, which survives from the 1633, which is from Seville. And it's a description of how to build these ceilings by a guy called López de Arenas. And he wrote it at the end of this tradition. So it was really when it was fading and it really stopped being part of the fashion of the time. But he wrote about the different groups of carpenters. So how highly trained they had to be, how only the very specialized carpenters were able to build those media naranja hemispherical ceilings. And while he doesn't give us, names, let alone, religious identities of these craftsmen, he does tell us about a very well-established, well-organized, and highly trained group of craftsmen who would have been known at the time. I think there's no doubt these were made by a small cohort of real experts. This is not a widely known technique.
I just wanted to add that so in the post-medieval special issue that we recently edited, I'll just go to the slide so that you can see. And also just to mention, they've, in celebration of the storehouse opening, they've made these essays open access. I'm not quite sure how long for, but now is the time to go online and download them all. But this essay here talks very interestingly about the movement of, how the movement of ceilings was not an isolated incident. And I think either in the paper that they give, or I can't remember if they include it in this article, but they do talk about a particular craftsman who was famous for making rejas, which is the ironwork is very distinctive artistic tradition in Spain, in Renaissance Spain. So it doesn't look at all Islamic, but apparently we have the name of one particular maker who has a Muslim name. So you know, we rarely know the names of the craftsmen, but even if we did, that doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, a Muslim or a Muslim heritage craftsman is going to be involved in making something that looks Islamic.
I'm interested in the materials. I'm assuming that during the conservation process, you did pigment analysis and so on and so forth. So could you tell us a little bit about that? How it worked from the area? That would also tell us something about how people are moving around with these things.
We took lots of samples, but it's still pending the analysis itself. So yes, something that it's very much on my mental to-do list. But do you want to talk about materials?
Yeah, I mean so the samples of the paint certainly they're still pending, and the samples of the wood too, no?
Yeah.
But it's it's thought that or it's likely that the wood is fine in this context.
The one in San Francisco the wood was analysed. I think some of the results are a bit strange, but they do seem to suggest it's largely pine. So that was
The one in the Alhambra, however, we have more analysis of some of these ceilings. So some of these earlier ceilings from the 14th century have many different types of wood in them. So the Pardal ceiling, which is now in Berlin, for example, has 5 different types of wood. And that makes sense when you think these are very weighty objects, which need to, each part, some parts of them are holding the structure up, some parts of them are nailed on in a decorative function. So you have different kinds of wood used for different parts, including cedar wood, as well as maple and fir and pine as well in the different parts of the ceiling. That's also true of the Comares ceiling, the throne hall of the Alhambra, which has been more analysed, the wood types, and they include different types of wood. And it's likely that the cedar that's included there is a reef cedar, so from the reef in North Africa, in Morocco. So they're not just using, well, they are using wood that they can get from the surrounding forests of Granada. They're probably also importing specialised woods from far away in order to be able to use them in particular parts of the city.
One of the things we didn't mention is the blog posts. So we've curated a whole series of blogs connected to Torrijos Ceilings, but inviting in other specialists. So you can access the blogs by going to the research website. All our outputs are linked there. But also one of the blogs was written by an expert in the polychromy on these kinds of ceilings. So it wasn't specific to the Torrijos ceiling, but she talks about the types of pigments that are generally used on these kinds of ceilings. The most recent one was around Spanish cultural heritage protection laws at the and how those changed in the early 20th century. So at the time when the Torrijos Palace was being dismantled, it was sadly possible for things like this to be sold out of the country. But in 1931, a whole raft of new legislation came in which protected it much more rigorously. So yeah, that's an interesting read by somebody who's done a PhD on that subject. And there will be a blog coming soon about the installation written by our colleague Matthew and Alan hopefully as well, the technician. So yeah, take a look there because there's a lot more information than beyond the sort of academic publications.
Great. Well,